Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alistair Burt, and I have the honour to be the chair of the Emirates Society here in the United Kingdom, the friendship society between the United Kingdom and the United Arab Emirates. I'm delighted that you're able to join us today, which is our first webinar since the 50th anniversary of National Day at the end of last week, the celebrations of which I'm sure have continued both in London and in the Emirates since December the 2nd. But it's very good to be able to welcome you today to quite a special webinar. I'm delighted to be joined by Her Excellency Razan Khalifa Al Mubarak, who leads the Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi, and Dominic Jermey of the Zoological Society of the UK. I will introduce them both in a moment more properly. Could I say what we're going to do is have a conversation between Dominic and Her Excellency for about 30 minutes. During that time, please, those of you who have questions, if you would add them to the Q&A on your controls. I think by now we're all pretty used to the Zoom process, but please put in your Q&A. And then at the end of the conversation, then we'll have a Q&A session where if we can, you'll be able to put your questions directly to Dominic and Her Excellency, but if for reasons for time that's not possible, I would just read the questions out, but we will cover as many questions as we can. So please, during the course of the conversation, please put your questions in the Q&A and then we'll come to you at the end. But first of all, let me introduce both the topic and our guests. I'm delighted that we're able to have this very special conversation about international conservation. We've got quite used in recent times to talking about the impact of climate change on weather and environment, but the issues affecting biodiversity have been discussed rather less often. So today is a real opportunity to put this back. What are the pressing issues? How urgent is the situation? Does biodiversity conservation work? And what are the roles of the various international organisations and those who are working to protect us? So to have two experts to discuss this, I'd like to introduce the following. Firstly, Her Excellency Razan Khalifa Al Mubarak, who leads the Environment Agency in Abu Dhabi, the largest environmental regulatory agency in the Middle East, and who is also the first Arab woman president of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, when she was elected just in September this year for a 4-year term in relation to that. Her Excellency has considerable experience, spent a career lifetime working in conservation in international philanthropic organisations dealing with biodiversity and conservation, and has been recognised for her work as one of the top 100 young global leaders by the World Economic Forum in 2018. Your Excellency, we're very delighted in the Society to welcome you today. Dominic Jermey is one of my global leaders, having been the ambassador to the UAE when I began my work there some years ago with the Foreign Office. And Dominic is now the Director General of the Zoological Society of London, looking after both Regent's Park, Whitton Aid Zoo, and the various research going with it. Previously, Dominic was British Ambassador to the UAE and to Afghanistan in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and Chief Executive UK Trade and Investment, and on the boards of both the FCO and the Department for Business, Innovation and Science. Originally an investment banker specialising in corporate finance, Dominic brought his considerable skills to the Foreign Office and international diplomacy, and now, of course, has this prestigious position heading up the Zoological Society of London. So I'm really delighted that we have two such experts to talk to us. What I would like to do is invite Dominic to begin the conversation with Her Excellency for around about 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. So please, if you would like to take the opportunity to put your questions in the Q&A, I'll be looking out for that. But in the meantime, I should also add, we've been joined by Her Excellency Rauda Al Mubarak, who is the Deputy Head of Mission for the Emirates Embassy in the United Kingdom, who's joining us on behalf of His Excellency, the Ambassador, who's unable to be with us today. So with that, we can commence. So Dominic, would you like to begin the conversation with Her Excellency? Thank you very much.
Enormous thanks to you and to the Emirates Society for hosting us both today, if I may speak on your behalf too, Razan. So when I joined ZSL 4 years ago, one of the absolute delights was learning about the relationship between the Zoological Society of London and Abu Dhabi, the Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi, which under Razan's leadership has led one of the world's most successful conservation programs, that of the Scimitar horned Oryx, the reintroduction of the species extinct in the wild. And quite a lot of people ask, does conservation work? And I just think it's a stunning example of how it does work. And it's also nice for this conversation today because it really situates that tradition of conservation in the UAE and in the UK very much, which is very, very relevant to the Emirates Society. So Razan, if I may, I'd love to hear how you got involved right from the very beginning in conservation, but in particular with EAD on the Scimitar horned Oryx program.
Thank you, Dominic. And I also just wanted to echo your words. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Emirates Society for inviting me to be part of this series of speakers. The UAE and the UK have historical ties, but like all relationships, and I'm learning that from my marriage, everything needs nurturing. And this people-to-people dimension is extremely important. And thank you again, the Emirates Society, for putting me and Dominic in contact again. So as Dominic was saying, yes, one example that has brought our two countries together is the interest, is the action, is the leadership on nature conservation. And this relationship is particularly strong because perhaps, Dominic, it's not one that is underpinned necessarily by business or political interests. It's, as you rightly said, it's intricately linked to a value of tradition and heritage of the leadership of both of our countries on the importance that they've placed on nature conservation as an issue in its own right. And so the first comment that I wanted to say is, in the UAE, working on nature conservation is not a new phenomenon. It's a legacy. It's a legacy of the founder of the UAE, and I think we're well placed to talk about this a little bit because of the 50th year anniversary since the establishment of the UAE. So the founder of the UAE, Sheikh Zayed, had this incredible instinct and moral empathy when it comes to the environment. And this empathy has and continues to be projected on a number of projects. One of them, of course, is the Scimitar horned Oryx project and the reintroduction of this iconic species back into the wild. And what's amazing, and what I find amazing, is, you know, having been involved in a number of institutions in the UAE, what I found is this value of the importance of nature, both within our borders and outside our borders, is now institutionalized. So it's very much part and parcel of our thinking in terms of our federal strategies, local strategies from an environmental agency perspective, and also philanthropic world. So in short, I find that the story or the around this, the protection and the conservation and the reintroduction of the Scimitar horned Oryx tells the story of two nations, tells the story of the importance of legacy, but it also tells us the story about diplomacy. And I hope that the success of this project will continue to inspire more projects in the future.
That is such a great introduction, and a really positive one, because I'm now going to take us into a slightly more challenging space. And Razan, you talk about diplomacy, and here in the UK we've hosted COP26, which was all about climate change, but really positively, for the first time, the biodiversity crisis and the links between what's happening on biodiversity and climate change was really part of the conversation. And nature-based solutions to climate change came up as one of the ways of addressing the challenges we face on climate. And one of the bits of science that ZSL does is we produce, and you know this document, Razan, we produce the Living Planet Index. And this is a measure of biodiversity decline over the last 45 years or so. And it essentially charts a decline in the abundance of wildlife populations of over 65% during that period. So in my lifetime, I'm that old. And that's a terrifying ruining of the environment that we all live in, we're intimately connected with. And nature-based solutions come up as important on climate change because the three big killers of biodiversity that we find through the Living Planet Index are climate change, are land use change, and the exploitation of wildlife, the illegal wildlife trade, that trophy hunting, other things. And so, Razan, as you take on the role of, frankly, the global leadership of the organization, the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that is trying to do something about biodiversity, but we see that background of decline. How do you get hope? How do you bring energy to such a challenging environment?
Thank you for this this question. And the first one is this. One is kind of this recognition, right? That often we link biodiversity and climate change as one of the same issues, or the same side of the same coin. But what's important, first of all, is for us to understand and recognize that addressing the issue of climate change will not necessarily address the others, the issue of biodiversity loss. Why? Because the drivers are different, and therefore the solutions are different. And we saw this very clearly during the pandemic. The economic slowdown, particularly in aviation, transportation, reduced global greenhouse gas emissions by 8%, which is the greatest percentage decrease in 100 years. But then if you look at what happened on the biodiversity agenda, the pressure increased, because job loss in cities led to a migration to rural areas that put additional pressures on the environment. But it also put a stop on what we call frontline workers in the conservation. So many of the NGOs that are working on the ground to protect nature, which is, and I hope the audience agrees with me, ultimately nature, why do we care about our nature? It's the fabric of life. That's where we get our food, the air that we breathe, all what is called nature ecosystems, protection from storm surges. So we need nature to survive. But as a consequence of this increased attention on climate change and this assumption that addressing climate change will have consequential positive effects on biodiversity is not necessarily true. And I think we need to debunk this myth. And ensure, and so with my new job as president of IUCN, is that we want to make sure, and I'll need your help and would love to hear from the audience, to make sure that biodiversity does not, or biodiversity loss does not play second fiddle to climate change. We don't want a planet where climate has stabilized but is devoid of life. As you said, the loss is colossal. We've already lost 60% of terrestrial animals. And thank you for the Living Planet Index that has shown these significant losses. We've already lost 90% of big ocean fish and around half of our natural ecosystems. We are also, if we do not do anything, according to the IPBES report, we'll be losing more than 1 million species over the next few decades. So really, this biodiversity crisis requires our attention. It requires a forging of a new deal and a new vision for nature. And we require a clear mechanism on how to get there. Dominic, would love your thoughts. I mean, from a ZSL perspective, do you also agree that biodiversity loss has been playing second fiddle to climate change? And how can we readdress this balance?
So that's a great question, Razan, and I think I just look at the evidence for that loss. We had probably very few people on this call will realize that we had an international meeting of the global community on biodiversity of countries who are signatories to the Convention on Biodiversity. That meeting, it was COP15, Conference of the Parties 15, took place in October. But it received almost no coverage whatsoever in the international media. And its follow-up meeting, it's split into two sections and will take place in April. And I think that we have to drive as a global community, and in our case, we're an NGO, so we're not part of government. And part of our role is to present the scientific evidence showing the impact of biodiversity loss, answering that question for politicians and for business leaders, why should I care? Because I think that's a pretty fundamental question. And to present that as loudly as we can so that there is engagement for that international meeting coming up in April next year. And we saw it's really hard, even with climate change, where people are very, very engaged. With the challenges around getting the funding required, getting the international commitments and the time frame required. Well, on the whole biodiversity debate just isn't in that space even at the moment. And so shifting it there, I think it's going to require action by governments, by civil society, and by businesses, not least to get the finance in there. There was a great, I don't know if you've read it, Razan, there was a brilliant bit of work, economics, by Sapata Dasgupta, the economics of biodiversity. Do you know it?
Yes, of course.
I mean, it just sets out so clearly, as I think Lord Stern did a decade ago on climate change, how we're not somehow separate from nature, but we depend on nature, and a lot of the ways in which we treat nature, like ships charging across oceans but polluting them as they go, or planes, or the kind of the exploitation of resources, and we treat nature as an unlimited resource, and it isn't. We are consuming it at something like triple the rate that is sustainable. I mean, it's pretty grim. So that's a bit of a recipe for leading up to the second half of COP15 next year. But what would, from your point of view, Razan, as president of the IUCN, you have a 4-year term at least. What would you like to see achieved within that 4 years?
I think, we've seen countries like the UK, like the UAE, take leadership roles in addressing biodiversity. So I'd like to see that group expanded to a global group. The Nature Pledge, the Leaders Pledge for Nature, initiated by the UK for the protection of the 30 by 30, so 30% of our planet by 2030, gives me great hope, but it also gives us a pathway to a vision of what do we need to do globally. And one thing that we need to do is certainly protected areas. the other thing is, it's not, I mean, it is complex, but at the same time, when conservation happens, it works. And there are a lot of examples that demonstrate this. So when we have marine protected areas, for example, that are well managed, and that's the important word there, that are well managed, that are well financed, you see in less than 5 to 6 years, a 600% increase in abundance of fish. So the return on our investment is in nature conservation is actually quite quick. You know, the study that you referred to mentions that nature provides humanity $125 trillion annually in ecosystem services. And so when we think about our investment in this fabric of life, it really pales in comparison. So I also would like to see an increased investment in nature conservation. What is critical also there is to recognize that the systems or the framework that will bring funding from the global institutions to local institutions, we need to reinvent this model. So there needs to be a recalibration of the financing model. How do we get finance to nature conservation? And let me just maybe perhaps elaborate on this. With climate change, we're looking at, and I'm so oversimplifying here and I apologize, we're really looking at investment in technology. It's one common yardstick that we are measuring our progress against, which is greenhouse gas emissions, or sometimes just simply CO2 emissions. On the biodiversity debate, it's much more complex because every country, every region will have its own biodiversity targets that are very difficult to aggregate on the global scale. And that's why I think we failed as a global community to achieve global biodiversity targets, because a lot of the action has to happen at a very micro, granular, local level. And so from a financing perspective, whilst we have big foundations and big funds that are earmarked for nature conservation, not big enough, but they're still there. But the question is, how do we get this big money that is very difficult to manage, that is very complex, in the hands of these small NGOs that actually are the frontline workers that need to do the conservation work? That's just one thing that I'd like to see is for us looking at this model and looking at how we can ensure that local communities get access to funding. From a private sector perspective, I've also been following a lot of interest in biodiversity and in nature conservation. But again, it's not there yet, because the narrative is still very heavily skewed on the climate change narrative. So initially, those who are joining us from the private sector, there was a big push with respect to CSR, or corporate social responsibility. And that was, again, that evolved because we recognized that CSR was often seen as a periphery and not part of the business decisions of the private sector. This has now evolved into the ESG model, environment, society, and governance. And a lot of investment companies, I know our sovereign wealth funds are drafting their ESG policies and frameworks. But again, the narrative or the definition of the E in the ESG is very much climate change oriented. So we need to be able to expand that narrative. Because ultimately, what you said earlier is, you know, one, if we stabilize the climate, great, that's fantastic, but we don't want to do it on a devoid and empty of life planet. But at the same time, we know that if we stabilize biodiversity loss, and protect nature, that will have a huge impact on stabilizing climate change. So for me, it's a no-brainer to focus on some of these joint solutions. And that's why the COP at Glasgow, for me, was a success, because it did state deforestation, for example, or halting deforestation as an important solution to climate change, and mentioned on a number of times the importance of nature-based solutions.
Yes, I think that was probably, I think it was the first time that nature-based solutions really came up in the climate change debate quite that strongly, Razan. So I really, really agree with you there. And some of what you were saying about local decision making, and that difficulty that we don't just have a simple measure of reducing carbon in the atmosphere as being the measure of biodiversity. It's a very complex range of national decisions, local decisions people need to make in order to see species no longer on the threatened list, etc. That complexity and pushing decision making down to a really local level, I think that's been done really well by some NGOs. So I think it's something that, for example, Alistair didn't have time to mention everything you're involved in, but there is the Mohammed bin Zayed Species Conservation Fund that supported over 2,000 NGOs at that very kind of grassroots level. And it's something that we as ZSL, we do, supporting individual conservationists in their area, wherever they happen to be, helping them to identify local sources of funding, how to engage the local community, because you need people to buy in for conservation. There's a reason why the animals have been threatened with extinction, and that's usually the local people. And so something needs to happen to change if those animals are going to be safe in the future. I think the funding models are really complex when we think about involving business. We've tried to develop sustainability bonds, in particular impact investment funding models to bring private sector investment into conservation. And this is at a really early stage. We developed an area in East Africa where we are marketing what's effectively a rhino impact investment there with partners. But it's a prototype really to kind of prove the point. And if we want the kind of transformation we need to see globally, we're going to need billions and billions and billions of this ESG funding coming into it. And I guess, just throwing it back to COP26, I'm really conscious that there is an opportunity for the UK and the UAE. You as the UAE are hosts of COP28, and that's the next but one. We've got nature-based solutions like reforestation, like restitution of mangroves, which is something where we as ZSL have been involved in that right from the very beginning. They're incredibly biodiverse. And all around the UAE, there are some fantastic examples of restoration of mangrove forests there. And as we look over the next couple of years, what could we do as two countries working together, two partners working together, to try and really shove forward the biodiversity agenda, kind of using the energy around the COP26 to COP28 and climate change conversation?
You know, and I think framing it like we have been as an opportunity, as an evolutionary process, in terms of, you know, not just in terms of the evolution of energy resources, from fossil fuels to others, but also evolution of transport, also evolution of aviation. And I find that personally very exciting because we are not, and also realizing that it has to happen on a continuum. You know, it's not a stop-start narrative, rather than a recognition that it has to evolve and evolve into something better for people and better for the planet, but also recognize that if we maintain and keep this discussion as a discussion that is only privy to the global north, we will not solve either issues. We need to recognize that ultimately needs to be solved and addressed and facilitated in the global south. And I think that's the big challenge there, is to recognize that if we're going to build better, which I think we all subscribe to, we need to be able to build better for all and everywhere. And so that system of prioritization is something that is a big challenge, to look at the global interest versus self-interest. But there's nothing wrong with self-interest as such. This is kind of, this is the way the world works. But it's recognizing that if we pursue a completely zero-sum game, we will lose the overall game. And that's something that is important. And like you said, numbers show us where we are today, and we're very far from where we need to be. I mean, only 18% of the global COVID recovery plans were green in 2020. And when I say green, much more, which is mainly on the climate change agenda. And even less than 2.5% went to nature-based solution. So if we're truly going to recover and build back better, we need the financing to back that up.
And we need the financing from, yes, from government, but we also need the innovative solutions coming up from the private sector.
No, exactly, and a big one that seems to be moving quite swiftly is in the production of our food. Because that has a huge impact on both the climate change and the biodiversity narrative. And you see new tech, new agri-tech in the sector addressing some of the issues by looking at new ways of feeding ourselves. I mean, it's ridiculous, Dominic. We produce enough food to feed 10 billion people, but waste more than a third of it. So clearly there's an opportunity there, not just in terms of what we produce, how we produce, and how we move the food supply chains around the world.
And I mean, just taking a step back and thinking about, just before Alistair joins us, what is it that we, as you and I are both professional conservationists, we're in this world, and yet we are identifying the solutions, but we're not able so far to get people on board for implementing them, because if we were, then we wouldn't see the degradation we're talking about. So what do we have to do differently? How do we manage to make that change happen?
I think, Dominic, to be very, is that we're too comfortable just speaking to each other. And what I mean is speaking to the same sort of circle of conservationists. And we have not been able really to break the boundaries and speak to those who might think differently. And that takes us back to some of our conversations we've had, in this sort of increasingly polarized world. We seem to insulate even further and just stick to those institutions or circles that perhaps we believe think the same. But to solve this complex issue, both climate change and biodiversity, we need to genuinely engage with the overall community. Businessmen, governments, indigenous communities, women, youth, and genuinely do that and not just pay lip service to it.
And that goes back to your point earlier about decision-making in the global south being the way through. And indeed, indigenous communities were one of the kind of transforming elements in Glasgow for making the delegates just think differently, because they were hearing loud and clear the impact of climate change on indigenous communities. And quite often it's a really similar impact for biodiversity loss. Razan, I see Alistair has appeared again, which I suspect means that it's probably now time for us to listen to some other people who may or may not agree with us, just as you suggested. Alistair.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, perhaps I'm coming in at the most appropriate time, but thank you both very much for leading our conversation so far. The phrase that I've taken away already is Her Excellency saying that nature is the fabric of life. And getting that sense over to us is so important. I really appreciate the conversation so far. We do have some questions that have come in. And interestingly, bearing in mind what you were saying about private sector engagement and the need to inject more, I'd like to ask Alison Fleming if she would like to ask her question and put it herself. She's an advisor to Respira International, which is an impact-driven climate solution carbon finance business. So that is your private sector engagement. And Alison, I'm not going to read out your question because you can come up with your question. So please, if you'd like to put your question to Dominic and Razan now, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Dominic and Razan, and many congratulations, Razan, on your presidency. It's fantastic to hear. And it's great to hear more about the relationship between the UK and the UAE, and specifically with reference to biodiversity, the recent COP26. We've been working with Etihad and on carbon, high quality nature-based carbon offsets, but we've also brought BGCI to them, and Etihad has been the sole sponsor of BGCI's biodiversity accreditation program, and that was announced at COP26. What I would love to hear from you is, how does that sponsorship become a bigger part of what is going on within the UAE in terms of biodiversity more generally? And even bigger than that, how does that encourage more corporates, more private financing to come into not just the climate side and nature-based credits, but into biodiversity more generally? Because I agree with you, there is a lot of interest. I think the narrative is changing and becoming a lot more compelling for normal people. And I think as this all gathers momentum, how do we corral that momentum to bring that financing in? Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in the UAE. That's wonderful to hear, and I'd love to learn more about it. Alison, I think success breeds success, and we need some good case studies announced that you know, and I'm sure with the work that you're doing with BTCI, it's about transparently really presenting to the world what you've been doing, and using that as an example of what works and what doesn't, and inspiring others to do the same. But as I was talking before with Dominic, you know, you are taking a very complex topic, you know, which is aviation, and making it potentially something that, you know, that can be palatable to both people and the planet. You know, you're not just taking a small industry, but this great big industry where, you know, people think that you can't move, but nevertheless, you've taken that step. And I think that is true leadership, and that is extremely inspirational. Dominic, what's your view?
Well, thank you, Razan. I'm just struck by a bit of a parallel a few years ago with the illegal wildlife trade. And this is the trade in rare species like the tusks of elephants, ivory, etc. And Emirates and Etihad, both together, decided, right, we don't want to be part of the problem here, we want to be part of the solution. Emirates was one of the founding partners of United for Wildlife, headed up by His Royal Highness Prince William. And by virtue of them both joining, the energy that they put in as corporates, that helped to catalyze partnership and membership from right across the global transport industry. Shipping, Dubai Ports World obviously was also part of it, shipping, aircraft, freight, railway businesses, all sorts. And we've seen a massive impact on stopping the criminal gangs behind the illegal wildlife trade. So it's still an issue, but now there is a global framework for engaging on it, and that's engaging on a policy level as well as practical action for intervention. And Alison, it would be fabulous to see Etihad having that kind of catalytic impact on the airline industry across the world.
If I can just add, then Alistair, if you don't mind, I mean, I'm quite new to this region, and one of the things that I find really exciting is not just the intent, but the will to collaborate. And one of the things that Eddie had made very clear when we were talking with them is that having done this sponsorship, they want to roll it out and make it available and useful and integrate it with anybody that would like to be a part of it. And I find that inspirational from the airline itself, but also from the sustainability team that has driven it. And I think there's a real value, broader value for the UAE, and it will also help encourage this relationship between the two countries.
Thanks, Alison, very much indeed. Your contribution is enormously welcome, and we'd like to have a chat to you on behalf of the Emirates Society as a result of what you've been saying. But thank you very much for your intervention just now.
Thank you.
We have a second question I'd like to call up directly from Lyle Gloker. Lyle is from the UN Migratory Species Office. And Lyle, if you want to put your question to our panel, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alistair. I hope you can hear me. Hi,
yes, very clear.
Hi, Razan. Nice to see you both. I head CMS Office Abu Dhabi, which has been hosted by Environment Agency Abu Dhabi for a number of years, since 2009. And we focus on migratory animals that cross international borders. They're shared biological resources. They're connecting countries, cultures, and ecosystems. And I have to say thank you to Environment Agency Abu Dhabi and to the UAE for hosting the office. I'd also like to point out that the UK and the UAE had worked together on one of the treaties that comes underneath the CMS framework. Back in 2006, the UK and UAE worked together on developing the Raptors MOU under the CMS framework. So thank you very much for that. And I think that's a great example of a long time ago, the two countries getting together, working together, and they saw value added in promoting international cooperation. My question to you both is perhaps more of a philosophical one. Does species conservation play second fiddle within the biodiversity conservation world to more ecosystem-based approaches for conservation?
Thanks, Lyle, very much indeed. Who'd like to field that one first?
Dominic, it's all yours.
Thank you for that, Razan. Hey, Lyle, good to hear from you this afternoon, and thank you for that question. And what great work you and the team are doing at TMS in Abu Dhabi. So thank you very much for that, which we really value. So we see the world. I joke when I asked what's my ambition, and I say, well, it's to save the world one species at a time. And so as ZSL, we see the world in terms of the species that we work on, and the species that we try to encourage people to value, because if they don't value it, they're not going to do anything about its loss, and they're just going to be lost in future. That's why we do such a lot of work on the red listing. This is the listing of those species that are almost entirely at risk of being extinguished. And we produce something called the EDGE list as well. And these are the evolutionarily distinct, globally endangered species. And these are the ones where if you lose that little critter, you have lost a branch of the tree of life. So I want to have my cake and eat it, to answer your question, Lyle. I think you can species live in places, they live within ecosystems, and you cannot simply reinsert a species if you don't think about the context within which it lives. And that's been some of the learning that we've really worked through the years in partnership with EAD to get right in Chad on the reintroduction of Scimitar horned oryx. You have to get that environment right. But for my money, you start with what you're trying to achieve with the species, and then you think about the context as the enabling environment within which that species can be restored. So Razan, I just put my head on the block. Back to you.
So the question is species playing second fiddle to ecosystem conservation within the nature conservation? Perhaps. But Lyle, I'm sure that, first of all, great to hear you. Lyle and I shared offices not too long ago. So great to be your neighbor once again virtually. But the thing is, globally this may be happening, but I can tell you locally, and you know this better than I do. What spurred the Raptors MOU between the UK and the UAE? It's really the story of falconry. And if you trace the story of falconry and falcon conservation in the UAE context, it was this fantastic bird, the fastest animal on the planet, that spurred the imagination of the leadership of institutions in the UAE to protect it. And it went beyond borders. So then it went to ecosystem restorations in the flight range of this incredible bird. And hence, we went to work with the governments of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, China, and it's that iconic species that built the building blocks for a wider context of nature conservation. Similarly, the picture behind me, the Scimitar horned oryx, it was this iconic species that then drove us, ZSL, and our many partners to protect one of the largest protected areas globally. And now are working on a multi-species approach to reintroduction. As you know, we've now introduced the addax, the ostrich, the gazelles. And so it takes an iconic species sometimes to drive a multi-species, multi-ecosystem protection program. So sometimes perhaps we play second fiddle, but I think in the project that I've been personally involved in, it's certainly been at the forefront of our thinking.
Good, well, thank you very much for that.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Lyle. I don't want to go too much over the hour, and we've got 3 questions to fit in. What I would like to do in the first place is go to Brian Harley, if I may, for him to ask his question. Brian is Director of Middle East Business Development for CFAS, the DEFRA agency, which is the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. And I don't know whether we met Brian, but I certainly remember working with CFAS in relation to a project in Kuwait some time ago when you were already engaged in the region. So you know the region well. I know the work of CFAS well. I was very proud as Minister to represent it. But Brian, you've got a question. Would you like to put in your question? And if I can have tight answers from colleagues, then we can fit the other 2 questions in, even if I have to read the other 2 questions out just to save a little bit more time. But Brian, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Alistair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question today. And I do remember you. You signed a document whilst I was standing in the background. But yeah,
well done.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to listen to today's conversation. And sort of part of the work that we do is sort of very much linked to this whole biodiversity loss protection and climate change. But I'm quite interested in how you think that governments can balance the needs of expansion due to population growth with the needs of protecting biodiversity and the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, very much. And as it's a government one first, do you want to have a crack at that, Dominic, as an ambassador on the politics side, and then we'll ask Razan?
Sure. Creating the policy environment that enables people to build biodiversity sensitive housing and accommodation, and thinking really carefully about how that can be achieved in a way that encourages biodiversity and supports rewilding and supports the kind of reconnection between people, especially a growing urban population across the world, urbanization, and wildlife. We all had that joy last year during the pandemic when goats re-entered the center of Llandudno or wherever it was, and there were other examples right across the world. And our hearts lifted in the middle of the pandemic because nature was reasserting itself. How do we create the serendipity that allows that to happen in a planned way as we develop the cities of the future? It's got to be doable.
Your Excellency?
So yeah, I mean, biodiversity is globally threatened, but not always by global threats. So most of the threats are local, and the relationship between biodiversity and people is also local. So I think the solutions to address the drivers of biodiversity loss are going to also have to be very locally centric, and so therefore it very much depends.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, it is a complex question, and we know that balancing these needs affects almost any society, and it's a constant issue, even in parts of the UK where there's a lot of planning and building going on. So it's very much up to date. We've only got technically 5 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is just read out the last couple of questions we have before I ask the Deputy Head of Mission of the UAE and the UK to round up with a vote of thanks. But let me ask the last two questions, if I may. Firstly, to slightly paraphrase the question from Fatina Jaber. I remember, Your Excellency, you were talking about food in relation to waste. And the issue that Fatina raises is about the waste of fashion industry and the market. And she makes the point, although it's specifically related to a business, which I understand Fatina has set up, and those details will be available on the chat if people want to find out. But she says, how can you support my projects in sustainable fashion, touching 5 dimensions of sustainability, which aligns with UN roles of sustainability until 2030? She wants it to be a leading fashion sustainability business in the Middle East, and it's based in Al Ain, where her fashion brand is from. So she has a particular question in relation to fashion and waste. And the last question, if you can bear it in mind, just at the end, is from Christopher Hamill Stewart from Arab News. And Christopher asked specifically of Her Excellency Razan, has your conservation work in the Emirates involved any cooperation with neighbouring countries? And does this approach add any value to conservation attempts in working together? So the issue of waste in fashion and its impact on conservation and biodiversity, and a question about cooperation with neighbouring states to the Emirates in your work, Your Excellency. So who would like to go first on those?
I can just briefly comment. Fatima, I'd love to learn more about your business. Very proud that it's being done in Al Ain. Fashion industry is obviously extremely important, particularly if you look at it from a youth perspective, and if you look at the trends of what youth also demand from their in terms of businesses and what they consume. So I think there's very big opportunity there, and I'd love to hear more. With respect to the question on working with neighboring states, absolutely. The ranges of space for animals are very restricted. If you look at it purely from a UAE or boundary restricted perspective, we need more space for nature, and we can't do it if we just look at it in a silo perspective. So particularly in our region, we share species, and we need to be able to share and work on cross-boundary protected areas, which we really haven't exploited yet. And it's something that we really need to do more of.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Dominic?
Well, thank you. And just following on from Razan's comments, I guess I would say wild animals don't have passports. And so it's news to them that there are borders between countries. And we do need to think in a trans-border, trans-boundary way. And then just to comment, Fatima, what a brilliant way you're approaching your fashion business. Think about it from the sustainability perspective. That research that I mentioned that we do at ZSL, the Living Planet Index, it shows the change of land use as being one of the critical killers of wildlife. And that's often to plant palm oil, to plant cotton, etc. So anything we can do to have a sustainable fashion industry is a really important element in that overall jigsaw. So thank you for thinking about it right from the very beginning.
I think Fatima was making a strong case about the circular economy and the importance of that's going to come from all. If our two panelists are happy that they have had the last word, can I thank them both very much indeed, but can I ask for a formal vote of thanks from Her Excellency Deputy Head of Mission Rauda Mohamed Al Taiba, who has been listening to the conversation from the Embassy of the UAE here in London.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. And again, it's my great honor on behalf of the UAE Embassy and of course on behalf of the Emirates Society, if I may, to thank Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak and of course Dominic for this extremely stimulating discussion. It's really great to hear the perspective of two people with such depth and knowledge on experience of these vital issues. And I know recently it is all too easy to get depressed about the challenges that we are facing. I think every day brings more bad headlines, let's say, about climate change, habitat destruction, species lost, and I don't want to add to this less COVID and the pandemic. So a lot of challenges, but what I really want to say today, this discussion is actually very, very refreshing to hear your conversation today and to understand from you what actually can be done and what is being done to tackle these challenges and to tackle these problems. And I don't just want to thank you for coming to talk to us today. I want to take this opportunity to thank you both for your vital conservation, I would say, work that you are doing so far. You are achieving so much in raising the public awareness and protecting species, not only in the UAE, and I think worldwide. And we are so proud, Your Excellency Razan, to have you in this important organization representing, I think, Arab women and Emiratis women. You are a role model for all of us. And I just want to end up by saying, I think leading to the COP28, we have so much to achieve to protect our planet. I agree with your comments on biodiversity and the links with climate change. But I think there is a lot of area that we can collaborate on. As you mentioned, involving the private sectors and in terms of finance, in terms of law. So a lot of issues that we can collaborate and work together to make the COP28 in 2 years in the UAE a very successful event. And looking, of course, for a great outcome of this event. So again, just want to end up by saying again, thanks again, Your Excellency Razan. Thanks again, Dominic, for this great discussion. And Mr. Bird, it's always nice to join Emirates Society's event. And I want to thank you and your team for organizing this excellent webinar and looking forward to keep in touch. Thank you.
Your Excellency, Rala, thank you very much indeed for your kind vote of thanks to esteemed panelists who've given us a really both an entertaining and informative hour and put a focus on something which we will all agree really needs more focus, and you've been able to spell it out very clearly and make it clear also the partnership between the United Kingdom and the UAE in this sphere as in others, and how dynamic and important that is. And certainly a few pointers heading forward to COP28, where we can expect to see this issue given perhaps even greater prominence than it's already achieved up to now. So can I also thank the team at the Emirates Society who've been responsible for putting this together and all the technicals. Can I draw attention of those of you on the line to a next event on the 14th of December, in a week or so's time, 5:30 in the afternoon. We're going to have a topic jointly with the International Association for the Study of Arabia, where we're going to look at Showpiece City, how architecture made Dubai. And when you think of Dubai, you can't help but think of the iconic buildings that are there. And it should be a fascinating talk by Todd Rice, who's recently published his new book entitled the same, Showpiece City, How Architecture Made Dubai. So that's coming next weekend on the 14th of December. So Your Excellency, Deputy Head of Mission, thank you very much for your attendance today. Pass our best wishes to His Excellency the Ambassador, to Dominic and Razan. Thank you so much for the presentations, and to all who've been online, thank you very much for joining the Emirates Society today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Do spread the word of the quality of the Emirates Society's productions, and wish you well for the rest of what is quite a stormy afternoon here in the United Kingdom, and hope it may be kinder wherever you are. But thank you to my team very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. Good afternoon.
Right, thank you.